Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Monica Schenkel-Jones, and I'm here with Amber Burson and Melissa Tamani for the WikiCred Demo Hour. And I'm here to kick off our presentation on our project, Reading Together, Reliability and Multilingual Global Communities. This is a 6-month research project that's funded by WikiCred, and we're studying the reliable source guidelines and related content policies and practices on English, French, and Spanish Wikipedia pages. So this is our team. So as I said, I'm Monica, and we are joined by a fantastic advisory board listed here on the right. And this is an art and feminism project. And the reason that we're presenting this project is because Wikipedia is extremely popular. It's a source of metadata and facts for other platforms. As many of you already know, it's the 8th visited site in the United States, the 13th globally. There's more than 500 million visitors per month on all Wikipedias, which represents about 20% of daily internet traffic. There's 20 million page views per day, 316 language versions. And in terms of mass articles, English Wikipedia has over 7 million, Spanish has over 1.6 million, and French has over 2.2 million articles. And the reason that I'm sharing all these statistics about Wikipedia is that Wikipedia matters, and research on the reliable source guidelines matters because it's being validated as reliable by the way that it's used and treated by other platforms. So for example, Google search prioritizes Wikipedia articles, as do home robots, such as Amazon's Alexa and Google Home. Many smart Internet of Things technologies are built using or drawing on Wikipedia's metadata for their knowledge graphs and to kind of inform their decision-making trees. Even more recently, Twitter has announced that it's going to be using Wikipedia's notability guidelines to help determine which Twitter users get that blue check verification. So for us, we're concerned about how reliable source guidelines are working and their impact on marginalized communities. And one of the reasons that we're concerned about this is because it is a user-run platform. It's different from other online platforms in that people who use the platform are the ones who are making decisions about the content and how it's managed. So we're seeing this platform that has a reputation for verifiable information in the way that it's used. It has a lot of traction on the internet globally, and we're really concerned about what that means for the communities that we work with. Earlier, I mentioned that this is an art and feminism project, and I just want to pause to take a minute to define that. Art and Feminism is an intersectional feminist nonprofit organization that addresses the information gap about gender, feminism, and the arts on the internet through do-it-yourself and do-it-with-others campaigns and research projects such as this one. And that project came to be through research that's been done on the biases in the user base on Wikipedia and sister projects. So we're seeing out of a 2010 and then a follow-up 2013 study on surveying regular users, editors of Wikipedia, there's a pretty massive gender gap. About 80 to 85% of English Wikipedia editors self-identify as male. The majority of editors in French and Spanish Wikipedias are similarly overrepresented by men. And this impacts the content. There's many more articles on topics that are related to men, military history, whereas arts and feminism are underrepresented. So this has informed the work that we do. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Amber to describe a little bit about what we're up to.
Yeah, so in thinking through how we could address some of these biases and gaps, we've been first trying to understand what the impact is of the definitions of reliable sources on underrepresented non-hegemonic communities. And we've been trying to understand what the difference is between English, French, and Spanish, and how this has an impact for larger communities. We want to see how source authority is negotiated among editors involved in these projects. And to do so, we looked first at qualitative research. So we looked at primary sources, which included the essays, guidelines, policies, etc., for the various languages. We looked at their talk pages as well. We also did some quantitative research. So we looked at who, when, and why the edits were made and how they were followed up in discussions. We also looked at secondary sources around this topic. We also hosted a series of community conversations in English, French, and Spanish, and provided translation for people that asked for it. And this helped us to understand how our community felt about these issues. And then the final step is to create a report with recommendations for a more equitable and reliable Wikipedia. So an important thing to note is that the guidelines are not the same in French, Spanish, and English. In fact, they vary significantly, and we're gonna demonstrate how. So I'm gonna start with French. So first of all, when you're a new user and you arrive to Wikipedia in French, you are invited to check out this page on comment citer vos sources, how to cite your sources, and you're directed immediately to a paragraph called Qualité des sources, the quality of sources. And it's a short paragraph. This is the entirety of it in front of us. And it is just like a really brief, like, you have to link to it. It has to be reliable. There's not a clear definition of reliable. However, there is a full translation, and that's the image on the right, of English language reliable source guidelines. And this is considered to be the more authoritative set of guidelines. However, it's not a guideline. It's an essay, which holds less authoritative weight on Wikipedia. There are also two other projects, which are Chez Manon and Observatoire des Sources, which list and deign what is reliable source, but they're more difficult to find, and they're projects. So I would add that the way that reliable source guidelines in French are managed is that they uphold a certain standard of French academia that's really tied to French from France understanding about truth and reliability. And of course, this excludes many, many sources from outside of France, including parts of Africa, the Caribbean, Quebec, etc. And it upholds a colonial and, of course, not a feminist way of understanding what reliability could be.
Thanks, Amber. I'm going to talk a little bit about the English Reliable Source Guidelines page and related pages. So the Reliable Source Guideline is one of 200 guidelines in English, and it's nested under the core content policies, and then under that, the 5 pillars of Wikipedia. And this is, as Amber said, pretty specific to English language Wikipedia. Other language Wikipedias have developed different community processes and practices for how their communities work. And for English, the Reliable Source Guideline page was started in 2005, so a couple of years after Wikipedia began in 2001. And approximately 1,200 editors have contributed to the page in the last 17 years. And they've made about 4,000 saves or contributions, edits. When we did kind of a deep dive into the history of this page, you can see that the majority of the content that's added to the Reliable Source Guidelines was added after 2006. And that's also the period of time when the fewest numbers of editors were participating. So the guidelines kind of have been added to by a very small number of users or editors, but they are upheld and maintained as this kind of gold standard of what reliable means constantly in other places. So they're marshaled in the general notability guidelines, which is the way in which editors decide if a topic merits an article. They're used and discussed in articles for creation and articles for deletion. So the idea of a reliable source is marshaled constantly throughout. But one thing that really stood out to us, and then also in our community conversation, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is that the number of editors who were deciding what reliable source means is very, very few. And yet, guidelines on Wikipedia don't need to be cited or based on secondary sources in the way that other encyclopedia articles do. So you don't need to have a source to decide that for example, as is the case on this guideline, a press release from an organization is an unreliable source. And yet, so there's no kind of discussion of literature that talks about reliability on this page. Citations, there's maybe 15 or 18 citations, and there are two very ad hoc things. What gives the guideline rigor is that it's based on the consensus of editors. And yet, as I noted, very few editors have contributed to the current version of the guideline. So this is kind of what we did in our early research on the guide, is just understanding what it is. And then we've had conversations with users and participants in Art and Feminism projects to look at how they've experienced the guideline. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mel to talk about Spanish.
Thank you. Okay, so in the case of Spanish Wikipedia, we have some similarities to the French version of reliable sources policy. And the main similarity is that this policy was also started as a translation from the English version in 2008. But the policy had its own discussions among the community, and there are things that are different now, but the core of the content, it's very similar to the English version of the policy. So that's something really important to take into account, because when Monica mentions that, for instance, very few editors participated in the creation of the English policy, or that you don't need a source to create the content of the policy, that is going to be reflected on the other languages as well. So one of the things that I found very interesting on the policy in Spanish is that the policy has a character of a sort of recommendation. It's very brief and general, and it has a lot of flexibility. So it has a lot of cases in which you have to interpret the policy to make a decision about if a source is reliable or not. But from the case studies and also from the conversations in the town hall in Spanish, what I can say is that the policy is interpreted in a very rigid way that is not necessarily like that on the text of the policy itself. So that's definitely something related to the way, the context where editors develop their work, and more about the editor's way of thinking than that's something related to the policy itself. Something very interesting about this policy is that it has some sections about a specific kind of sources, And we've seen that the problem of the existence of systemic bias in secondary sources is not considered as a special area of consideration. So that again, that's a problem because we're not recognizing that many communities have been left out of history. So having said that, I would like to start talking a little bit about some of the findings of this project. Again, a full list of findings will be included in the white paper, but we also want to share some things right now. And the first one is related to what Monica just mentioned a few minutes ago, and is that Wikipedia guidelines on reliable sources in English and Spanish are not rigorously formulated, and the updates to these policies are made by very few editors. So it's really difficult to talk about a general consensus when we're analyzing these policies. And as Amber mentioned, in the case of French Wikipedia, we're not talking about a policy itself, we're talking about an essay. The other finding we have is that there's a vague meaning of community consensus. And in many instances, the silence is interpreted as consensus. So if there are people who don't participate on these discussions, and there are very few editors who are making the decisions at the end of the day. So I would like to pass it to Amber to continue talking about the findings.
So the aesthetics and page layout, and of course the style of editing of these policies and guidelines is done only it's not a visual editor. So what we see is that in the same way that using the visual editor can increase participation and increase comfort amongst new editors, but also experienced editors, the lack of the lack of ability to use a visual editor in this context sort of it decreases people's participation and often puts them off from it. You can go to the next slide. There's a disconnect between editorial processes and reliable source definitions. So we see a disconnect between how what is written down in these policies is carried out. So we see that when new editors contribute content to articles about marginalized communities, they're quite likely to have their contributions contested and challenged on the grounds of unreliability, particularly due to the active use of new page patrol. And so edits by users who are not auto-confirmed, which is like 10 edits over 4 days, will be flagged almost automatically. So these software flags new articles and contributions for patrol editors for review. And this level of surveillance, or this added level of surveillance in the editing process, can really call into question the contributions and their sources. And it just creates a lot of anxiety. People won't come back. But how it plays into verifiability and reliability means that people find that if the source is not already listed, it will be more likely to be contested. And of course, there's many new sources being created all the time. You can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, and so what we're finding is that contributors, especially new contributors, are being challenged to prove their sources. And when you're proving something in the Wikipedia editorial back channels, often the best way to do this is through knowledge or insight into the other guidelines. And this requires tremendous kind of insight, time to get this insight. There are over 200 guidelines on English Wikipedia. So if you're going to be able to stand up for your contribution, there's kind of the expectation that you're knowledgeable and are able to use swiftly a kind of back insiders shortcuts or language in the way that you write. Now, earlier we mentioned that we hosted a couple of town halls. We hosted community conversation town halls for all 3 language groups, and we provided translation for these. And these were really rich, long conversations that we had with participants, primarily in art and feminism activities, but there were also editors and folks who use Wikipedia who care about these topics. Librarians were there. And one of the things that really stood out for me that I want to share with you is a quote from a participant in the English town hall who said, "It shocks me what a hold certain people, the editorial community, have on what is considered real knowledge about our communities." And this was the effect of what Wikipedia does, of how this process works. This is the effect of that, which is that people are told that they don't have or aren't legitimate to share real knowledge if they're not able to use and participate in Wikipedia in the kind of technical culture that's required of it. And this was a very important finding, I think. That isn't the first time that this has been noted, but I think it persists today. And this matters. The work that we've been doing and the findings that we've shared for you matter to Wikipedia and to all of the other internet industry players that rely on Wikipedia. The reliable source guidelines and the in situ interpretations can and do negatively impact marginalized communities. And so this work matters to all of us who care about credibility. There's really important work that's being done and that needs to happen about the policing of misinformation, of disinformation campaigns, of vandalism, but ensuring the rigor of references and the kind of police work that happens to dissuade vandals from participating and, looking for sock puppet accounts, it can't also sweep out certain communities and police them. We don't want that to happen. And yet what our work demonstrates is that the way in which these guidelines are created and monitored in situ has a negative impact. We're writing up our white paper and final report now with recommendations, and we'll be sharing these out. And we'd love for readers who are concerned about this to see what our recommendations are. And I can kind of give you a preview to say the recommendations will be to reconsider or possibly have a rethinking of consensus. Silence can't mean consensus, for example. As well, why is it that press releases are considered unreliable? What is it about a press release that makes the institution that's sharing that information invalid or unreliable? And these are a couple of the things that we're going to suggest are taken up for consideration further for all of us in the credibility sphere who are concerned about how information is represented and shared. You can follow our work at this Medium page, readingtogetheraf.medium.com. And I will kind of wrap up our presentation by again thanking the project funders and supporters who have helped us bring this into fruition: Art and Feminism, WikiCred, and Miss InfoCon. So thank you everyone for your attention today, and thanks to the advisory board, the participants in our town halls, and to my colleagues Amber and Mel. And I think that's it.